Yesterday we heard from one former Prime Minister about the China relationship and the recent stories on Chinese interference in Australia. Today we're going to hear from another former Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull. He joins me from his Sydney office. Mr Turnbull, thanks so much for your time. Nearly 2 years ago exactly, in fact, you introduced the foreign interference laws to this parliament. What's been your reaction to the latest revelations of covert attempts at influence in this country?
Well, Kieran, obviously they're very disturbing, but we've been warned for some time by the intelligence services and security services that there is a growing risk of foreign interference in Australia's political system, and that is one of the reasons why I introduced in 2017 and passed in 2018 strong foreign interference, new espionage laws and foreign influence laws. So those were really groundbreaking in both in an Australian and a global setting. They're a very important statement of our determination as Australians to ensure that our political system, our democracy, is influenced by and participated in by Australians. This is our country, and we have to preserve for ourselves the right to influence our democracy.
Were you aware of this case when you were Prime Minister, where Chinese intelligence agents allegedly attempted to implant their own candidate into this parliament via the Melbourne seat of Chisholm?
Kieran, the particular case that is in the papers, has been in the papers this last week, is not something that I was aware of. I'm not sure anyone was aware of it, when I was PM, which is over a year ago now. But the risk of foreign interference in our elections and foreign parties seeking to obtain influence through political donations, through membership of political parties, all of that has been very well known for some time, has been warned against for some time. None of this is new. In other words, there may be specific cases that are new, but the problem, the syndrome, is one that we've been aware of for quite some time. And hence
Nick Warner, the director of...
That's why I legislated to ban foreign donations too. So, all of this was part of a parcel of seeking to ensure that we defended our own sovereignty. Now, if I could just say this, there's nothing improper with foreign countries, their diplomats or foreign companies, individuals making a case in Australia, expressing their opinions, seeking to influence public opinion, as long as it is done openly. And so the foreign influence legislation, which I hope the government is actually enforcing, because there's not much point having these strong laws and not enforcing them, but the foreign influence legislation is designed to ensure that people who are seeking to influence our political system, our government or parliamentary system, and who are doing so on behalf of foreign governments or foreign political parties, have to be transparent about it. So we are an open democracy, and sunlight, transparency, is actually the best way of ensuring that we are able to maintain our democracy and to do so in a way that preserves our sovereignty in ourselves as Australians.
When you say you hope the government's enforcing the laws, that no point having them unless you enforce them, have you been given any indication that that's not happening?
Well, I think it's very important for the government to demonstrate that they're doing it. I think the government has to demonstrate all the time that it is doing everything it can to keep Australians safe and to preserve the integrity of our democracy, the integrity and the sovereignty of our democracy. Now, I think that at these times, when you've got a degree of public anxiety, it's very important for the government to demonstrate that, because during my time in government, we introduced those laws, we passed them. I was criticised extensively, both in some of the international press. I remember the Global Times in from Beijing was particularly frenetic, hysterical almost in its criticism of me, and there was plenty of criticism domestically. There is a disturbing habit, I might say, for some people in Australia, that whenever the Australian government does something that displeases people in another country, particularly in China, or indeed even in the United States, to immediately criticise the Australian government. The reality is that the only way an Australian government or an Australian Prime Minister will receive undiluted praise from other countries is if we don't do anything that disturbs their ambitions. In other words, everything we do falls into their plans and their expectations. So if you want to have a government and a leader and ministers who stand up for Australia, then you have to recognise that from time to time there will be some pushback from other countries. But that's the price you have to pay if you want to defend your sovereignty, as I did.
Your predecessor, one of your predecessors, Kevin Rudd, yesterday said that you were uncritical of China early on as Prime Minister and in opposition. He said that on Huawei, for example, you told the company that you'd review the ban that Labor put in place when it came to the NBN. And also he criticised you in terms of the Port of Darwin. He says that it was on your watch that a Chinese corporation took out a 99-year lease of the Port of Darwin, which horrified the Americans, and the Chinese couldn't believe their luck. Would you have taken a different approach to the various matters that faced you in terms of China if you had another opportunity in those earlier years as Prime Minister?
Well, the first thing is what Kevin Rudd said is factually wrong in just about every respect. The decision to lease the Port of Darwin, which was taken to the Chinese company Landbridge, was taken by the Northern Territory government, and it was checked out by and approved by the Defence Department and the relevant security agencies in Australia before I became Prime Minister. So that process was all completed. Those approvals were given before I became PM. And after I became PM, as I said publicly, I went back to the Department of Defence and checked that they had gone through it, and they had done that. Now, whether that assessment was mistaken or not, the fact is there was a process, it was considered, but as it happened, it was done before I was PM. As far as Huawei is concerned, the reality is that, and I don't make a criticism of Kevin Rudd about this, but I don't think he's ever taken the time to understand the nature of the networking characteristics of the fixed line infrastructure and the NBN versus, for example, a 5G wireless network. They're very different. It is possible to integrate, to have equipment from what you might call high-risk vendors in fixed line networks where the equipment is at the edge of the network, and you can the risk of there being the risk to the overall network, because the equipment is, if you like, at the very edge, is much less. In 5G, where my government did take the decision to keep high-risk vendors out of it, because of the different nature of that network, because of the virtualisation of that network and the distributed processing of it, there isn't really an edge in the way there was or is in many of the traditional fixed line networks, of which the NBN is one. So Rudd is just he's just wrong in that respect. And I have to say, it is disturbing that he, on many occasions, when Australian governments have since his time, have stood up to pressure from the Chinese government, Kevin Rudd has not shown much sympathy or solidarity with the government of the country that he once led, our own Australia.
He accuses you fundamentally of taking a 180-degree turn on China in 2017. He argued yesterday because you faced domestic political pressure within your party What do you say to that? Did any domestic considerations come into play when you considered Chinese policy or policy towards China?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. I undertook a review, a very systematic review of foreign interference, the potential for it, the reality of it in Australia, which began in 2016, not long after I became Prime Minister. I've always been very clear-eyed and objective in terms of our foreign policy situation and set all those points out publicly. I mean, I don't know why Kevin is so bitter and hypercritical in this way, but my track record in working in China and writing and speaking about it has been very objective, very clear-eyed, and very consistent. I mean, the reality is, and Greg Sheridan made this point, as indeed did my son-in-law James Brown on Q&A just a couple of nights ago. The reality is, Chinese foreign policy and strategy has changed significantly under Xi Jinping. It is much more assertive. You've only got to compare. We've only got to look at the expansion in the South China Sea is a good example of that. So China is taking a much more assertive role internationally and regionally, and that is, that obviously is met with reactions and responses from other countries, including our own.
It's also been shown by the new analysis from the Lowy Institute that China has more diplomatic posts, a larger number of embassies and consulates now than even the United States. So we often talk about their hard power assertiveness, but in terms of soft power, they seem. The question is, do you think they're trying to fill the vacuum left by a retreating United States?
I wouldn't go that far. I think that the Chinese diplomatic effort is expanding. You'd expect that. The country is becoming so much richer and stronger that it is naturally acquiring greater reach in terms of its diplomats and obviously greater hard power in terms of its military capabilities. Its most potent means of influencing other countries, however, is financial. The most powerful weapon, if you like, for China or lever for persuasion and influence is its financial resources, and that comes from being a richer and richer country as its economy grows.
Peter Harcher, in his quarterly essay, says, he asks the question, will Australia keep trying to protect itself against Chinese intrusion, or will it propose working together? He says we need to do both. How do you believe Australia should manage that challenge of achieving what has become a polarised debate in many respects in this country, either pushing back or achieving some ongoing cooperation?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the debate is as polarised as it is uninformed. Look, the reality is this. In the imperial capital, whether it is Beijing or Washington or in years past London and Paris, they regard deference as their due. So if you wish to stand up for your country, for your sovereignty, particularly as a middle power like Australia, you have to assert that. And you have to be prepared to face a bit of pushback from time to time. But the important thing is to always stand up for your own country. And just because another country is critical of Australia doesn't mean Australia's at fault. There are too many people in the commentariat, in business and in politics who are all too ready to take the side of the foreign critic rather than respecting Australia's right to stand up for its own interests. Now, I believe that we have a great relationship, a great friendship with China. We are family. There are 1.2 million Australians of Chinese heritage. 2 of them are Lucy and my grandchildren, 2 of our 4 grandchildren. So, China and Chinese people are part of our history, part of our multicultural nature, a multicultural nation. But when you talk about China, the state, China, the Chinese Communist Party, which is in effect the state, the government of China, then there will be times when their interests, their ambitions will be at odds with ours. And in those circumstances, we simply have to be strong and honest, blunt occasionally, and stand up for ourselves. Because believe me, and I know this from first-hand experience, when Australia stands up for itself, it wins respect. When we flatter and cajole, when we defer, then we may get a slap on the back, but we win no respect, and we're not defending our interests.
One final issue, quickly before I let you go, a domestic issue. The opposition's been critical of the Prime Minister for phoning the New South Wales Police Commissioner over the Angus Taylor matter. Do you believe it's appropriate for a Prime Minister to make direct contact with a police commissioner in that sense?
Well, it is always critically important that in any police inquiry, particularly something that involves a politician, that the police are and are seen to be acting entirely free of any political influence. Now, I'm sure the call that the Prime Minister made to the New South Wales Police Commissioner was innocuous, but it would have been much better had it not been made, because it is vitally important that inquiry that is being conducted by the New South Wales Police, like every inquiry they undertake, is seen to be conducted entirely free of political influence. And so it's a call, being blunt about it, it's a call that I would not have made.
Mr. Turnbull, appreciate your time. Thanks.
Thank you.